Welcome to MindEdge, where we explore the hidden future of humanity and technology. Subscribe now and understand the future before it understands you. The 2030 Climate Plan is not a plan. It is an operating system. And by the time the public understands that, the permissions will already be coded, the limits already calculated, and the algorithms already monitoring every aspect of daily life. Governments spent decades pretending climate policy was about awareness, incentives, or voluntary moderation. But by 2030, the narrative shifts completely. The game is no longer persuasion. The game is enforcement. States have realized a simple truth. You cannot hit emission targets when the population is free to behave however it wants. And once this logic enters public policy, everything becomes measurable, controllable, and restricted. Across Europe, North America, and Asia, the first layer is already in place. Controlled emission zones. Quietly rolled out city by city, they redefine mobility by turning ordinary streets into segmented access corridors. Every entrance and exit becomes a data point. Every vehicle becomes a tracked entity. Cameras, plate scanning systems, and geo-fenced maps merge into a single network that decides who can move where, at what time, and at what ecological cost. The official justification is always the same: reduce congestion, lower pollution, improve air quality. But the hidden function is more structural. These zones accustom the public to the idea that freedom of movement is conditional. That access is not a right, but a variable. That mobility can be restricted, suspended, or priced dynamically. And that is only the visible part, because the real pivot of 2030 is the personalized carbon permit, a tool long dismissed as conspiracy theory, now tested in pilot programs in multiple countries. The principle is brutally simple. Every individual receives an annual carbon allowance tied to their lifestyle, their location, their energy consumption, their travel habits, and eventually their social profile. Every purchase, every kilometer driven, every train taken, every package delivered becomes a microtransaction deducted from a personal quota. On paper, it sounds like a managerial tool. In practice, it becomes a behavioral cage. The mechanism works because it plugs directly into digital payments. Once money becomes fully traceable, programmable, and tied to identity, carbon accounting can run silently in the background. The user doesn't need to do anything. The system does everything. You buy meat 4 times this week? The app notifies you that your food emissions score is rising. You book a cheap flight for a weekend trip? The system suggests a train alternative and reminds you that your annual travel quota is already 80% used. You drive during peak hours. Your mobility emissions spike, and the algorithm flags you as inefficient. Multiply this by 50 million citizens, and you get a society where consumption becomes a monitored resource, not a personal choice. In the heart of the whole structure is artificial intelligence. Not the flashy AI that writes poems or answers questions. The silent AI that integrates into infrastructure, payment systems, transport networks, and municipal management. It runs in the background, cross-referencing your location data, your purchases, your utility usage, and your travel patterns. It learns your habits, predicts your behavior, and adjusts your permissions before you even think about them. Governments call this optimization, but what is actually optimized is your compliance. By 2030, this AI becomes the gatekeeper between you and the physical world. You want to enter a low-emission zone? The AI checks your vehicle category, your remaining emission credits, the current pollution level, and the predicted traffic. If the parameters don't match, access simply turns red. You want to buy a high-impact product? The digital payment system intervenes with a warning, a surcharge, or eventually a refusal. You want to travel spontaneously? The system evaluates your annual mobility footprint and decides whether you have enough ecological margin to justify the trip. This is not science fiction. It is not 2050. It is the direct projection of policies already written, voted, or tested today. The 2030 framework is built on three converging pillars: digital identity, smart payment systems, and environmental scoring. Combine them and you get a world where autonomy is replaced by algorithmic permission. The psychological shift is just as important as the technological one. People begin to internalize the idea that excessive mobility is irresponsible, that high consumption is suspicious, that spontaneous behavior is unsustainable, and slowly, the population self-regulates. Not because they want to, because the system conditions them through incentives, penalties, and constant feedback loops. The transport sector becomes the first battlefield. Cars become monitored nodes, each emitting a real-time environmental score. Insurance gets tied to driving patterns. Parking fees adjust dynamically based on pollution levels. Road access becomes auctioned during peak hours. Owning a vehicle becomes a privilege for those who can afford the ecological cost. Everyone else is pushed toward public transport, shared mobility, or restricted zone living. The idea of jumping in your car and going anywhere at any time becomes, for most people, a memory. But the deeper transformation happens in daily consumption. Food, heating, streaming hours, online orders, fast fashion, electronics, everything gets measured. Everything gets associated with a carbon cost, and the system doesn't need to forbid anything. It simply adjusts the price algorithmically. When the algorithm wants people to consume less, it raises the carbon multiplier. When it wants them to shift towards certain behaviors, it lowers the cost. Freedom remains technically intact, but the economic environment becomes impossible to ignore. This is where AI reveals its true role: the silent administrator of human behavior. It doesn't force, it nudges. It doesn't punish, it adjusts. It doesn't imprison. It shapes the environment so that the rational choice is always the option the system wants. And once carbon permits become normalized, scaling the system becomes trivial. Health scoring, water quotas, energy allowances, digital access levels, all justified by resource optimization, climate pressure, or emergency management. The architecture is the same. Only the variable changes. The mechanism remains identical: continuous surveillance, algorithmic scoring, dynamic permissions. The year 2030 becomes the inflection point where mobility ceases to be a default freedom and becomes an authorized action, where consumption becomes a monitored footprint, where personal choice becomes a calculated variable, and the public, overwhelmed by daily life, inflation, and economic pressure, accepts the system because the alternative is presented as collapse. What makes this new climate order powerful is not that it restricts, it's that it personalizes. Every individual has their own quota, their own score, their own limit. There is no collective resistance because everyone is isolated in their own data bubble. No one knows if their neighbor has more or fewer rights. No one can measure if the system is fair or arbitrary. Everyone negotiates privately with the algorithm. The final stage is when society starts to mirror the software. People adjust their schedules, diets, commutes, entertainment, and habits to preserve their carbon score. Life becomes a strategy game where the objective is not freedom, but compliance. And the irony is that governments won't need to enforce anything physically. The population will enforce it on itself, fearing penalties, restrictions, or social consequences. The truth is simple. The 2030 climate plan is not about saving the planet. It's about reshaping human behavior through silent, total, algorithmic governance. A world where freedom is not removed, it is redefined. It becomes a variable controlled by a system that understands you better than you understand yourself. And in that new world, the most powerful form of control is not force, it is permission. This transmission ends here. The next one is already forming. Stay aware and subscribe to Remain in the Signal.